Hello everyone, it's Diane. I am very excited to share this journal with you. This one is for me. It's one of my very favorite journals that I've made, if not the best, the very favorite. But it's because it was for me, and so I included a lot of my favorite things in it. As I mentioned in another video, I had made this journal with an old Grimm's Fairy Tales books. It was a very vintage book when I acquired it as a young child. Well, as a child anyway. And it fell apart, and so I turned it into a reading journal in which I recorded books that I read and also quotes from those books. And I used it for 2 years. I still have, there were just a few pages left at the back. And, but I want to start a new one for 2018. So I took this vintage book cover, Five Little Peppers and How They Grew, because I remember my aunt reading it to me. My aunt had 5 boys, and every summer one of my sisters and I would go and spend about a week there so she could have a couple of daughters for a while. And she used to read chapter books to us kids before we went to bed, and I remember her reading this to us. I don't remember anything about the story, I just remember that she read it to us. However, I bought this at a flea market, and I am reading the book right now, but I needed the cover, so I'm reading the book without the cover. And I'm enjoying it. So anyway, the book has 3 signatures. I put on these pretty metal corners and a hitch fastener with a hair tie. And I left the spine on it, but it was very worn right along where it bends, and I didn't trust it. So even though I reinforced it with Tyvek on the inside and then covered it with some sturdy cardstock, I didn't want it to split out here, so I covered it with this, it's a sort of a heavy fabric. And I put a charm on it. I haven't made a charm in quite a while, but I added one to this, and I will add I will add some more probably to the upper area because it looks kind of thin up there, but I really wanted to get this filmed because I have a lot to do today. So I just want to show it to you, and I want to take my time with this, so it may take 2 videos to get it in. There's a lot involved in it. I just want to say that it's pretty eclectic. I love vintage children's book illustrations, and so I included a lot of them in different styles. And I also used Mrs. Coggs. I think the digital set is called A Good Book, and I will link that below. So you may think that they don't go well together, the vintage children's illustrations and these digital illustrations that came from Mrs. Coggs, but it's for me, and they are my favorite things, and so I like the way it looks. So let's just go on through. I used a scrap of Graphic 45 cardstock here to make a pocket and stamped "This Book Belongs To," and I used a piece of crochet trim here. My tags, I cut out children's illustrations for most of them and glued them on, and this is a piece of the fiber that I now carry in my shop. This is a illustration from Bambi, not the Disney version. Alright, and then here we have a piece of coffee dyed scrapbook paper with an illustration that I fussy cut from a children's book. And there's this gorgeous pale yellow eyelet that I don't have a lot of, and so I use it very sparingly. And a little piece of vintage mint green rickrack. I love using fabrics in my books and trims, so there's a lot of it in here. So this is just a little fabric collage that I did, and I stamped this hand on a piece of coffee dyed muslin and stitched it on. And this is fussy cut from a children's book. There's a piece of trim. Another thing that I used is actually washi tape. So it didn't come from a book, but they look like they could be book illustrations. I got this roll of lady washi tape from the Everyday Journal on Etsy, which is Lori Jagadish's shop, and I'll try to remember to link that below also. I think there might be about 7 images, and you'll see them throughout the book. And I loved it, and I just got it recently, so I wanted to put them in the book. Here's a vintage children's book page. This is ledger paper, but it's actually coffee-dyed scrapbook paper, and I put a piece of fabric around the edge and zigzagged it on. Little tiny piece of fabric and a little piece of lace. There's one of the ladies from the washi tape. This is vintage ledger. This is from a vintage children's book. I love that illustration. This is from the same book, and I stitched it on as a side-loading pocket with a little piece of blue vintage rickrack. This is one of Mrs. Cog's images. I zigzag stitched it to coffee dyed paper and added a little piece of lace, and she just tucks in there. This could have been me as a child. I have always loved books. My mother used to make us go outside and play in the summer. I mean, who has to make a kid go outside and play? Maybe nowadays you do, but back then we didn't have video games. And I would play for a while, but I always took a stack of books out with me, and I would always end up on the porch reading my books, which frustrated my sister. So here's a cutout from a vintage children's book. I love those little duckies. And this is something that somebody sent me quite a while ago, and I love it, so I'm glad I got to put it in my book. She sent me a few of them. And here's another Mrs. Cog's image. She's supposed to be getting dressed, I think, because she's only half dressed, but she couldn't tear herself away from her book. That's how I see that picture. Again, it's zigzag to coffee dyed paper. Here's a lovely piece of fabric, and I think this might be some sort of upholstery trim. I'm not sure, but I think it's vintage. Somebody sent that to me. This is an illustration from a gorgeous Snow White book. Again, not the Disney version. I love it. And then here we have a cutout from a children's book of a grandma reading to her grandchildren, and I do love to read to my grandchildren, as I did to my children. Vintage ledger. This is a vintage children's book, and I reinforced it with washi tape here. And that is the center of the book. I loved this illustration. This is actually from, I've got the book right here, Robert Louis Stevenson's A Child's Garden of Verses. And this was this page right here. And I love it because I like owls. I love the colors, and I just thought it was great in the center. And I put some little hearts on the strings, and then I put on this little journaling spot so I can put a quote from a book there. I put a piece of vintage ledger on the back of this Snow White page. This is a vellum or a glassine envelope that I got from Denise's Tattered Dream Shop. And I put on a little piece from a children's book, and then there's a little monkey cut from another children's book. Some seam binding there. I can put a quote on the back of that tag. This is from a very vintage children's school reader. I love that picture. And some crocheted trim stitched on. I did a lot of sewing in this book. These little cutouts are from Hans Brinker and the Silver Skates. So where I would normally, when I finish decorating the pages for my books, I would take them over to my stamp table and stamp on the pages. But instead of doing that, I cut out book illustrations and glued them on. Here's a piece of daisy trim that I got from Hobby Lobby, a pocket made from scrapbook paper scrap, and this is from a vintage children's book. And here is a Mrs. Cog's illustration. This is from a children's book. Again, in lieu of a stamp. This page, this picture from a children's book happened to have a cow on it, and I happen to have a cow playing card, and this from a children's reader, which was very vintage, Mrs. Mooly Cow. And I put ledger paper on the back for journaling, adding a quote. There's another playing card with a rabbit on it and an illustration from, I think it was a Tom, not Tom and Jerry, Alice and Jerry book. Love that. And then that's the back of the first signature. Next signature, this is an illustration from the actual book. I have some more of these illustrations, and I may trim them and glue them to coffee dyed paper or ledger paper and be able to include them in the book. I don't know if I'll be able to use them all, but this one I just glued on. And then there's a fabric collage of some gorgeous fabrics. Here's just a little tiny scrap of paper with a little illustration from a vintage reader stitched on. And this is an illustration, digital, from Mrs. Coggs. And I believe it said that this is a painting by Renoir of Monet reading. I may be wrong. I'm sure it's Renoir, but I can't remember which artist it is reading. I think it's Monet. And a couple of little tags. And there's some trim here. I love this illustration from a children's book. And there's another one in color. And I love this vibrant paper too. Fabric, little piece of fabric and a piece of trim. And Winnie the Pooh, one of my all-time favorites, the original Pooh books. This is from a vintage children's storybook. Vintage ledger paper, and this, I use some of my vintage gift tags that I hoard, but I did use a few of them in this book, so I could have some to keep. That way I'll be more willing to use them in journals that I sell. Here's another of Mrs. Coggs' images, and I stitched on a piece of that pale yellow eyelet and made it into a pocket, and another picture from Hans Brinker on this tag. And this page has some more ducklings cut from a vintage children's book, and there's a little vintage sticker that came with wrapping paper of a duck. And then this is from a children's reader that has some ducks and quack. And I have a stamp that I stamped this cute little duck onto a gridded index card for journaling. And then this is a vintage shipping label. I don't remember if somebody gave this to me or if I purchased it from an Etsy seller, but I know I didn't find it myself at a flea market. I may have found it on Etsy, or it may have been gifted to me. I wish I remembered. Here's another fabric collage with this piece of crocheted trim that I really like, and this fabric with a chair on it. And this is not a vintage page, but I love this book page. The colors, the style, the fairyland. I just love that, so I had to include it. And I put a glassine envelope or bag from Tattered Dream, another illustration from a children's reader. This seam binding is vintage. There's another page, another side of that page with mushrooms, and it's a little fairyland. You can see little creatures in there. I love it. I don't even remember what book it was. Vintage ledger, and there's another one of those ladies on the washi tape. And the center with Wizard of Oz. And we're halfway through the book, and I'm almost at 15 minutes, so I'm going to do a part 2 to this video.